In the summer of 1405, the largest fleet the world had ever seen slipped out of the Yangtze River and into the open sea. 250 ships, 27,000 men. At its center sailed the treasure ship's nine-masted giant so wide across the deck that Columbus's Santa Maria, the ship that would reach the Americas 87 years later, could have fit inside one of them with room to spare. The admiral's name was Zheng. The empire behind him was Ming China, the wealthiest, most sophisticated civilization on Earth. And the ocean in front of him was essentially uncontested. China sailed to India, to Arabia, to the east coast of Africa. 7 voyages in 28 years, reaching further than any European power would dare attempt for generations. Then in 1433, the ships came home for the last time. The fleet was left to rot at the dock. The sailors were reassigned to haul grain on inland canals. The blueprints were burned. And the court issued an edict that remains one of the strangest sentences in the history of human ambition. Not even a single plank is permitted to go to sea. China had held the world in its hand and let it go. 60 years later, Christopher Columbus, a confused Italian working for Spain, bumped into a continent nobody in Europe knew existed, and the world was never the same. So the question isn't really about Columbus. The question is, why was it him? In the early 1400s, the world already had a global economy. It did not look like ours. There were no stock exchanges, no telegraph cables, no steam engines, but wealth moved across continents in enormous quantities and had done so for centuries. Silk from Chinese looms arrived in Venetian warehouses. Pepper harvested in the jungles of southern India reached the dinner tables of London merchants. Gold mined in West Africa paid for grain in North African cities. The planet was, in its own way, already connected, and that connection ran along routes that were ancient, well-mapped, and tightly controlled. At the center of it all was a single system. Traders called it the Silk Road, though it was never one road, and silk was only part of what it carried. It was a web of overland routes and sea lanes stretching from the South China Sea to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. Thousands of miles of mountain passes, river crossings, desert tracks, and ocean monsoons that had been moving goods and ideas between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe since before the birth of Christ. By the 1400s, this system was the economic backbone of the known world. The goods that moved along these routes were not luxuries in the casual sense. Spices, above all, had become something close to a civilizational necessity, not just for flavor but for medicine, for preservation, for religious ceremony, and above all for status. At a feast thrown in 1475 for the Duke of Bavaria, the kitchen accounts record 386 pounds of pepper, 286 pounds of ginger, 257 pounds of saffron, and 205 pounds of cinnamon consumed in a single evening. Spices announced wealth in a way that almost nothing else could, and every ounce of it had traveled thousands of miles to get there. In the mid-15th century, a pound of pepper in London cost more than 2 days' wages for a skilled craftsman. That was pepper, the cheapest of the major spices. A pound of saffron was worth more than a pound of gold. The great households of Europe spent fortunes on their spice cabinets, and the fortunes spent on spice cabinets ended up somewhere. They ended up in Venice. Venice, in 1400, was one of the most astonishing cities on Earth. It had no farmland, almost no natural resources, and a population crammed onto a cluster of islands in a shallow lagoon. What it had was position a port at the western end of the trade routes that connected Europe to the Islamic world, and through the Islamic world to India and China. For 3 centuries, Venetian merchants had built a commercial empire on the simple fact that every spice, every bolt of silk, every dose of medicinal pepper that entered Western Europe passed through their hands first. Venice taxed it, warehoused it, and resold it at whatever price it chose. By the 1400s, the city's wealth was legendary across the continent. East of Venice, controlling the overland routes themselves, sat the Islamic world. In 1400, it was not one empire but a civilizational sphere the Ottoman Turks consolidating power in Anatolia, the Mamluk Sultanate holding Egypt and the Levant, Persian and Central Asian rulers commanding the great interior routes. What these powers shared was a centuries-long inheritance of knowledge that dwarfed anything Europe possessed. Islamic scholars had preserved and extended the geographical works of ancient Greece. Their astronomers had mapped the night sky with instruments of extraordinary precision. A court timekeeper in Damascus in the 14th century calculated the direction of prayer to Mecca for dozens of cities across the world, and his figures remain barely improvable today. Islamic merchants had sailed the Indian Ocean for generations. They understood the monsoon winds, the great seasonal reversals that could carry a ship from Arabia to India in 6 weeks, or from India back to the Gulf in another 6. They built vessels suited to those waters, plotted routes that no European navigator had ever attempted, and traded in every major port from East Africa to Southeast Asia. The Indian Ocean was, in the most practical sense, an Islamic sea. To the west of the Islamic world, occupying the narrow but strategically vital passage between Europe and Asia, sat what remained of Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire had once stretched from Spain to Syria. By the early 1400s, it had been reduced to Constantinople itself, a magnificent and exhausted city encircled by Ottoman territory on every side. Holding on through a combination of diplomatic skill and the difficulty of the siege. But what Byzantium still held, even in its twilight, was something neither the Ottomans nor the Europeans possessed in the same concentrated form: the accumulated cartographic knowledge of the ancient world. Ptolemy's geography, the great compendium of coordinates, coastlines, and calculations assembled in Alexandria in the 2nd century, had been preserved in Constantinople through 1,000 years of upheaval, copied and annotated by Byzantine scholars who kept the classical tradition alive. The Greek text of Ptolemy's geography reached Florence from Constantinople around 1400 and was translated into Latin for the first time in 1406. For European scholars, it was an earthquake, a systematic framework for understanding the shape of the world that their own tradition had almost entirely lost. The knowledge had existed for 14 centuries. It had simply been sitting in the wrong city. And then there was China. The Ming Dynasty in the early 1400s was the largest, wealthiest, and most administratively sophisticated state on earth. Its population was enormous, its cities vast, its technology generations ahead of anything in Europe. The Yongle Emperor, who came to power in 1402, was a man of colossal ambition. He rebuilt Beijing, he completed the Grand Canal, he commissioned the Forbidden City. And in 1403, he ordered the construction of a fleet that would announce Chinese power to every corner of the known world. That fleet launched in 1405 under Admiral Zheng. Its purpose was not conquest or trade. In the European sense, it was tribute diplomacy, the projection of imperial prestige. Ships arrived at foreign ports, bearing silk and porcelain, and left bearing foreign rulers pledges of submission to the Son of Heaven. It was an enormously expensive way of conducting foreign relations, and it worked. By the time of the 4th voyage in 1413, the fleet had reached the Persian Gulf. By the 6th, it touched the east coast of Africa. No civilization on Earth had a longer maritime reach. Europe, in this same period, was sailing along its own coastline. The most advanced European navigators of the early 1400s were the Portuguese, feeling their way cautiously down the western bulge of Africa, rarely out of sight of land. In ships, a fraction the size of Zheng's smallest support vessels, European cartography was a patchwork of classical misreadings, theological imagination, and sailors' rumors. The maps that circulated in European courts placed Jerusalem at the center of the world and filled the unknown margins with monsters. In terms of raw civilizational capability, the ranking in 1400 was not ambiguous. China led. The Islamic world was deeply sophisticated, commercially dominant, and scientifically advanced. Byzantium held the classical archive. Venice controlled the European end of the most profitable trade routes on Earth. And Europe, meaning the kingdoms of France, England, Castile, Portugal, the German principalities, the Scandinavian crowns, was a secondary player, wealthy by its own historical standards, but demonstrably behind in every measure that would seem to matter for global exploration: cartographic knowledge, navigational skill, ship technology, and commercial reach. The question of why the world changed the way it did cannot be answered by looking at which civilization was strongest. It has to be answered by looking at what happened next, and specifically at what happened to the one thing every European kingdom depended on more than anything else: the road to the east. The Ottoman Empire did not appear suddenly. It had been building for over a century before the fall of Constantinople, a process so gradual that European courts had long convinced themselves it could be managed, contained, perhaps even used. The Ottomans were not savages at the gates. They were sophisticated administrators, skilled diplomats, and experienced traders who understood perfectly well that the wealth of the Eastern Mediterranean depended on commerce flowing freely through the routes they were steadily absorbing. Their expansion was not a declaration of war on European trade. It was something more unsettling, a structural takeover of the entire system on which that trade depended. The Ottomans had been in Anatolia since the late 13th century, pushing steadily westward from a small principality on the edges of what remained of Byzantine territory. By the mid-14th century, they had crossed into the Balkans. By the early 1400s, they held most of the land routes between Europe and Central Asia. The overland passages through Anatolia, the paths that connected the markets of the Levant and Persia to the ports of the Black Sea and the Aegean, were Ottoman territory. European merchants could still use them. But they used them on Ottoman terms, paying Ottoman tolls, moving through Ottoman customs posts, operating within a system where the rules were no longer theirs to set. Then came April 1453. Sultan Mehmed II was 21 years old, and he had spent his early reign preparing for one thing: Constantinople, the ancient capital of Rome, the last redoubt of Byzantium, the city that had resisted every siege for over 1,000 years, sat at the precise choke point between Europe and Asia, controlling passage between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Mehmed understood what it represented. He commissioned a Hungarian cannon maker named Orban to build him a weapon unlike anything the world had seen. A bronze barrel so large it took 60 water buffaloes and several hundred men to haul it from Edirne to the city walls. The cannon worked. After 55 days of bombardment, walls that had held for a millennium cracked and gave way. On the morning of the 29th of May, 1453, the Janissaries poured through the breaches. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died in the fighting or disappeared into it, his body never conclusively identified. The city that had been the intellectual and commercial hinge of the known world for 1,000 years passed into Ottoman hands before the day was out. News reached Venice within days. The reaction across Europe was something between grief and terror. Constantinople had not been a great trading city. In its final years, poverty and plague had shrunk its population to perhaps 50,000. A ghost of the million who had once lived there. But its symbolic and strategic significance was immense. It sat on the Bosphorus, the narrow strait that was the only sea passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Whoever held it controlled whether Genoese grain ships could move south and whether Asian goods could move west. Now the Ottomans held it, and they were not finished. In the decades after 1453, Ottoman expansion continued without pause. Athens fell in 1458. The Genoese trading colonies along the Black Sea coast, the commercial outposts that had been the northern terminals of the overland spice routes, were absorbed or destroyed. Bosnia fell in 1463. By the 1470s, the Ottomans had reached the Adriatic coast. The circle around European access to the eastern routes was tightening, not quickly but relentlessly, the way a slow tide fills a harbor quietly, steadily, and without any obvious point at which it became too late to move the boats. The trade itself did not stop. This is the crucial nuance. and it matters enormously for understanding what actually drove the age of exploration. The Ottomans were not ideologically opposed to commerce, far from it. Spices continued to flow through Alexandria and Beirut. Venetian merchants continued to operate in Istanbul under negotiated agreements. As late as the 1540s, European traders were still buying spice in Damascus. The Ottoman Empire was not a wall. It was a toll booth, a very large, very powerful toll booth that extracted its price from every transaction, imposed its conditions on every movement of goods, and could change those conditions whenever it chose. That last point was the one that kept European merchants awake at night. It was not that trade had been severed, it was that security had. For 2 centuries, the rhythms of the spice trade had been largely predictable, expensive, yes, and filtered through multiple intermediaries, but structurally stable. A Venetian merchant in 1430 could plan a voyage to Alexandria, estimate his costs at each stage, calculate his profit on return, and invest accordingly. After 1453, that predictability was gone. Every route now passed through territory where the sovereign was not European, not Christian, and not bound by any arrangement that couldn't be revised or revoked. Prices could spike without warning. Access could be restricted. Entire routes could be closed. The anxiety expressed itself in numbers. The price of pepper in European markets rose steadily through the second half of the 15th century, not because the Ottomans had banned trade, but because every additional layer of Ottoman administration and taxation added cost, and because the mere perception of instability drove merchants to price uncertainty into their margins. In the 1470s, the Venetians watched their spice profits compress year after year. They complained bitterly to each other, sent ambassadors to negotiate, and made the best arrangements they could. They could do nothing more because they had nothing the Ottomans needed badly enough to be leveraged against. For the kingdoms at the western edge of Europe, Portugal, Castile, Aragon, the situation was even starker. They had never been part of the Mediterranean trading system in any meaningful way. Venice and Genoa had controlled that game for centuries, and the western Atlantic kingdoms had always been peripheral to it. The spices they consumed had passed through multiple sets of hands, Islamic, Byzantine, Italian, before reaching Lisbon or Seville, marked up at every stage. They paid the final, most inflated price, and received none of the profits. When the Ottoman expansion made the whole system even more expensive and precarious, they had no existing position to defend and no entrenched interest in preserving the old arrangement. They had only the need to find something cheaper and the Atlantic coastline at their backs. The psychological rupture of 1453 should not be underestimated alongside the commercial one. Europe in the mid-15th century understood itself partly through the existence of Constantinople, the great Christian city of the East, the living bridge to Rome's imperial tradition, the place where the ancient world had been preserved. Its fall to an Islamic empire was experienced as something close to catastrophe, a sign that the world as European Christians had understood it was under fundamental threat. The Pope called for a crusade. Nothing came of it. The European kingdoms were too divided, too broke, and too busy fighting each other to mount anything coherent. The call echoed and faded. What remained was the problem. The routes were controlled. The costs were rising. The old certainties were gone. And the only geographical feature left in European hands that pointed toward anything useful was the Atlantic Ocean, a vast, poorly charted, deeply frightening body of water that almost every serious navigator of the 15th century regarded as a graveyard. It stretched west into absolute darkness. Nobody knew what was at the other end, if anything was there at all, but it was theirs, and it was beginning, slowly and under enormous pressure, to look like the only option. The Ottoman consolidation was not a single event that shut a door. It was a decades-long process that narrowed a corridor, a process that any individual merchant, in any individual year, could reasonably hope might stabilize or reverse. The crucial feature of the pressure it created was precisely that it never produced an obvious moment of crisis. There was no day when a decree went out, and the spice trade stopped. There was only the slow, grinding realization, accumulating across 2 generations of European merchants and monarchs, that the world they had been navigating was being reorganized around them, and they had not been consulted. By the 1470s, that realization had taken hold. The question was no longer whether Europe needed an alternative. The question was whether any alternative actually existed and whether any European state had the combination of geography, desperation, and political will to go and find it. The question sits at the heart of the whole story, and it deserves a serious answer. China in the early 15th century had everything that is supposed to produce maritime empire: the largest ships ever built, navigational knowledge centuries ahead of Europe, enormous state resources, and a fleet that had already reached the east coast of Africa. If the age of exploration was fundamentally about who could project power across the ocean, China had proved it could do that before any European state had seriously contemplated the attempt. So, why didn't it? The answer is not a simple one, and anyone who gives you a simple one is probably wrong. But it begins with understanding what those voyages were actually for. Zheng He's fleet was not an exploration program. It was not a trading enterprise. It was a performance. The Yongle Emperor had come to power through a military coup. He had seized the throne from his own nephew in 1402, a violation of the dynastic succession that left a shadow over his legitimacy. He needed to demonstrate, on a scale that could not be argued with, that heaven had chosen him. The treasure voyages were that demonstration. Foreign rulers prostrating themselves before Chinese envoys, offering tribute in the Forbidden City, acknowledging the Son of Heaven's dominion over all under heaven. This was what the fleet was built to produce. The ships were magnificent, but they were stage machinery. The logic of the tribute system was entirely different from the logic of European expansion. European maritime ambition, when it came, was driven by profit, by the commercial desperation of merchants, and the revenue hunger of crowns. Every voyage had to pay for itself or justify itself financially. China's treasure voyages operated in reverse. The emperor gave away more in gifts than the foreign rulers brought in tribute, deliberately, because the imbalance was the point. Generosity demonstrated superiority. The fleet was an instrument of prestige, not accumulation. That meant it could only exist as long as an emperor personally wanted it to exist and was willing to fund it from the imperial treasury with no expectation of return. The Yongle Emperor died in 1424 on campaign against the Mongols in the north, far from the sea. On the day his son inherited the throne, the new emperor, the Hongxi Emperor, terminated the voyages by imperial decree. He had spent his years as crown prince working closely with the Confucian civil bureaucracy, and those officials had been opposed to the treasure fleet from the beginning. Their objections were not petty. The voyages cost millions of taels of silver per expedition. The treasury was strained. The northern frontier, where the Mongol threat remained constant and immediate, demanded resources that were being poured into the ocean. Finance Minister Xia Yuanji had argued the point for years. The moment his emperor died, he won the argument. The Confucian objection ran deeper than money, though money was real enough. The scholar officials who administered the Ming state operated within a worldview that placed agriculture at the foundation of civilization, regarded merchants with suspicion, and considered foreign engagement a distraction from the proper ordering of the realm. The ocean, in this framework, was not an opportunity. It was a source of disorder of pirates, of smugglers, of Chinese subjects who went abroad and returned corrupted by foreign ways. The Haijin, the sea ban that had been in place since the dynasty's founding in 1368, had already restricted private maritime trade to state-controlled tribute missions. The treasure fleet was a spectacular exception to that general orientation, kept alive only by one emperor's personal will. When that will was gone, the general orientation reasserted itself. There was one more voyage, the seventh, launched in 1431 under the Swan Emperor, who had something of his grandfather's expansive temperament. Zheng He was 61 years old by then, and he knew it was the last. The fleet sailed to the Persian Gulf, to Arabia, to the coast of Africa. Zheng died on the return voyage, at sea, somewhere near Calicut. His body was almost certainly buried in the Indian Ocean, though legend says his crew brought a lock of his hair and a pair of his shoes back to Nanjing. The fleet came home to an emperor who had already decided there would be no eighth voyage. The ships were docked, and the sailors were reassigned to haul grain on the inland canals. What happened next revealed something important about the nature of institutional knowledge. The fleet's blueprints were ordered destroyed. In 1477, a Ministry of War official named Liu Daxia burned Zheng logbooks and navigation records to prevent any future emperor from being tempted to repeat the expense. Within 2 generations, the craftsmen who had known how to build the great ships were dead, and the knowledge had died with them. China had possessed the most advanced maritime technology in the world and had deliberately dismantled it, not through conquest or catastrophe, through paperwork and politics. This is where the eunuch versus official conflict becomes more than a court intrigue. The treasure voyages had been a eunuch enterprise from the start. Zheng himself was a eunuch, and the voyages were administered through the imperial eunuch network rather than the civil bureaucracy. The Confucian officials who opposed the voyages were not simply opposing foreign adventure. They were opposing a rival power center within the state, one that reported directly to the emperor and operated outside their control. Ending the voyages was, among other things, a bureaucratic victory. The officials who burned Zheng records were not just ending an era of exploration. They were ensuring that no one who threatened their institutional position could use the sea as a base of power again. 1449, and the disaster that sealed everything. The Zheng emperor personally led an army of 500,000 men against the Mongols near Tumu Fortress, barely a day's ride from Beijing. The Mongols annihilated them. The emperor was captured. It was the greatest military catastrophe of the Ming Dynasty, and its consequences for the sea were total. Whatever remaining appetite existed at court for expensive ocean ventures evaporated overnight. The northern frontier, the wall, the garrisons, the endless campaign against the steppe absorbed every resource the empire could spare for the next generation. The ocean was simply not a priority for a state fighting for its survival on land. The result was a vacuum. The Indian Ocean, which China had dominated in the early 15th century, was left without its dominant power. Arab traders continued to sail it, as they always had. Indian merchants worked the coastal routes. Southeast Asian states managed their own waters. But the force that had been capable of projecting power from Nanjing to Malindi, that had brought giraffes and lions back to the emperor's menagerie, that had made foreign rulers understand that a civilization of incomprehensible scale lay to the east, was gone. When Vasco da Gama reached the coast of East Africa in 1498, locals told him of great ships from the east that had once called there. He had no idea what they were talking about. The structural lesson of China's withdrawal is the most important thing this chapter has to say. China's failure to become a maritime power was not a failure of capability. It was a failure of incentive structure. The treasure voyages had no commercial logic and no self-sustaining mechanism. They depended entirely on the personal commitment of one emperor, operated within a political system structurally hostile to maritime enterprise, and competed for resources with a land frontier that presented immediate and undeniable existential threats. When the balance of those forces shifted, as it inevitably would, given enough time, the voyages stopped. Not because China couldn't sail, because nothing in the structure of the Chinese state required it to. Europe, by contrast, was about to discover that something in the structure of the European state specifically, something in the structure of its commercial desperation, required it to try almost anything. The contrast is not between superior and inferior civilizations. It is between a state that already had what it needed and a civilization that was running out of options. China was wealthy enough, stable enough, and large enough to turn inward and survive. Europe was not wealthy enough, not stable enough, and facing a commercial crisis severe enough that inward was not a direction it could afford to turn. One more thing needs to be said about the Chinese decision, because it is genuinely strange, and strangeness deserves acknowledgement. China held the tools to do what Europe would do, to sail beyond the known world, to establish commercial footholds across the Indian Ocean, to find and exploit the wealth of unknown coasts. The decision not to was made by a small number of officials, driven partly by ideology, partly by institutional self-interest, and partly by the accident of which emperor died when. A different succession could have produced a different outcome. The difference between a world shaped by Chinese maritime empire and the world that actually exists may come down, at least in part, to the fate of one man on campaign against the Mongols in the summer of 1424. The Yongle emperor died in his tent, hundreds of miles from the sea. His son was already drafting the decree that would end the voyages before the body was cold. In Nanjing, the ships sat in their harbors, the largest wooden vessels the world had ever produced, waiting for orders that were never coming. They waited long enough to rot. Two other civilizations had better reasons than Europe to crack open the globe, and better tools to do it with. The Islamic world, meaning the interlocking network of Arab merchants, Persian scholars, Ottoman administrators, and Malay traders who shared a faith, a commercial language, and centuries of maritime experience, was the most geographically connected civilization on Earth in the early 15th century. A Muslim merchant in Cairo could correspond with a Muslim merchant in Calicut, using shared commercial law, a shared written language, and a shared network of credit and trust that stretched across the entire Indian Ocean. Byzantium, meanwhile, sat on the accumulated cartographic knowledge of the ancient world, preserved through a millennium of careful scholarship, at the precise geographical crossroads between Europe and Asia. On paper, either of these civilizations was better positioned to do what Europe eventually did. Neither of them did it. The reasons are as instructive as the reasons China didn't. Start with the Islamic world, because its case is the more straightforward of the two. Arab navigators had been sailing the Indian Ocean for centuries before the first Portuguese caravel crept down the African coast. They understood the monsoon winds, the great seasonal reversals that made long-distance ocean sailing not just possible, but predictable. They had developed instruments, charts, and accumulated voyage records that gave them a working picture of coastlines from East Africa to the South China Sea. The astrolabe, refined and systematized by Islamic astronomers, made celestial navigation a precise science. Muslim merchants had established trading communities in every major port from Kilwa in East Africa to Malacca in Southeast Asia. The Indian Ocean was, in the most practical and commercial sense, their sea. And that was precisely the problem. The Islamic world didn't need to explore the Atlantic because it already had what exploration was supposed to find. The wealth of the East, spices from the Moluccas, silk from China, cotton from India, gold from East Africa, flowed through Islamic intermediaries. Arab traders sat at the commercial nodes of the most profitable trading network on Earth. The routes were known, the relationships were established, and the profits were real. There was nothing in the Atlantic that promised to be better than what the Indian Ocean already delivered. The unknown ocean to the west of Africa offered only risk, not reward. You don't cross a terrifying unknown sea when the sea you know is generating the wealth of the world. There is also a structural point about Islamic political organization that matters here. The Islamic world, in the 15th century, was not one state. It was a civilizational sphere, a shared religious and commercial culture that spanned dozens of different political entities, from the Ottoman Empire in the west to the Sultanate of Malacca in the east. This was, in many respects, a strength. It gave Islamic commerce a reach and resilience that no single state could match. But it also meant there was no single sovereign power, with both the will and the resources, to mount a sustained, state-funded program of oceanic exploration into entirely unknown waters. Such programs required a centralized crown, with a specific strategic reason to fund them. The Islamic world had plenty of centralized crowns, but none of them had a strategic reason that pointed toward the Atlantic. The Ottomans, who came closest to having that kind of centralized power, were fully occupied through the second half of the 15th century with the consolidation of their empire absorbing the Balkans, managing the eastern frontier against Persia, and extracting the maximum commercial advantage from the trade routes they now controlled. They had no incentive to seek an alternative to routes they already owned. When Portuguese ships finally appeared in the Indian Ocean at the end of the 1490s, the Ottomans did eventually respond, but it took them decades to mount a serious naval challenge. And by then, the moment had passed. They were a land empire that had acquired a maritime position. The Portuguese were a small Atlantic kingdom that had built its entire identity around the sea. The Islamic world also had a specific conceptual limitation worth naming. Islamic geography in this period was extraordinarily sophisticated, far more precise and comprehensive than anything in Europe. But it was oriented eastward and inward. The great tradition of Islamic geographical scholarship had mapped the known world from Spain to China with a detail and accuracy that European cartographers couldn't match. What it hadn't done was speculate systematically about what lay beyond the known world. The Atlantic, the Sea of Darkness, as Arab geographers called it, appeared at the western edge of Islamic maps as an expanse of terrifying emptiness beyond which lay nothing knowable. European geographic ignorance turned out, in a deeply counterintuitive way, to be an advantage. Not knowing how far away Asia was across the Atlantic made it psychologically possible to attempt the crossing. If you knew, as Islamic geographers essentially did, how large the Earth was, and therefore how impossibly far West Asia must lie, you might reach the same conclusion Columbus's critics in Spain reached, that the plan was simply mad. Now to Byzantium, which presents the most poignant case of all, because the gap between what Byzantium possessed and what it was able to do with that possession was wider than for any other civilization of the period. The Byzantine Empire in the early 15th century was effectively dead as a political entity. Its territory had been reduced, through centuries of pressure from the Seljuks, the Crusaders, and then the Ottomans, to the city of Constantinople itself and a few scattered possessions. The emperor ruled a city. His army was a few thousand men. His treasury was empty. When the Venetians and Genoese, whose commercial interests had been intertwined with Constantinople for centuries, declined to send meaningful military support against Mehmed II's siege, they were making a cold-eyed calculation that the empire was no longer worth saving. But what Byzantium held, even in its political twilight, was the most valuable intellectual archive in the world. The library collections of Constantinople preserved Greek manuscripts that had been lost in the West since the fall of Rome, texts of Ptolemy, Aristotle, Archimedes, the accumulated geographical and astronomical knowledge of the ancient world. Byzantine scholars had spent 1,000 years copying, annotating, and transmitting these texts. The knowledge they contained was extraordinary. Ptolemy's geography alone, with its system of coordinates and its understanding of the Earth as a sphere, provided the theoretical foundation without which oceanic navigation on a global scale was impossible to conceive. The problem was that Byzantium had knowledge but no power, and knowledge without power cannot project itself across oceans. A state that cannot defend its own capital from siege cannot fund exploration fleets. The Byzantine emperor in 1450 could not have equipped a caravel, let alone a fleet. The knowledge sat in the libraries, available to scholars, available to be copied and translated, but locked in a city that was about to cease to exist. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the scholars who survived fled west, most of them to Italy, carrying their manuscripts and their linguistic expertise with them. The knowledge that had been trapped in Constantinople was now loose in Europe, available to the courts and scholars of a continent that was simultaneously running out of other options. This is the part of the story that tends to get lost. The fall of Constantinople is usually presented as a catastrophe for European civilization, the loss of the great Christian city of the East, the Ottoman advance into Europe, the severing of trade routes. All of that is real. But the fall of Byzantium also released something. The Greek scholars who arrived in Florence and Venice and Rome in the 1440s and 1450s brought with them exactly the intellectual resources that European navigation would need. Ptolemy's coordinate system, astronomical texts, geographical knowledge. They brought it to the one part of the world that had a commercial reason to use it immediately. The Byzantine case and the Islamic case converge on the same structural point. Knowledge without incentive does not produce exploration. The Islamic world had navigational knowledge, but no commercial pressure to venture beyond the trade network it already dominated. Byzantium had geographical and astronomical knowledge, but no political or economic power to act on it. Neither civilization faced the combination of capability and desperation that produces the specific kind of reckless, state-funded oceanic gambling that the age of exploration actually required. Europe, specifically, the kingdoms at the Atlantic edge of Europe, had something neither the Islamic world nor Byzantium possessed in the same form. A commercial crisis, severe enough to make the terrifying option look acceptable, combined with a slowly growing access to exactly the intellectual tools the classical world had developed for understanding the shape of the earth. The knowledge came from Byzantium. The desperation came from the Ottoman Closure. The geography came from the Atlantic coastline. None of these factors, alone, would have been enough. Together, in a specific place at a specific time, they created the conditions for what happened next. To understand what drove Europe into the ocean, you have to understand what Europe actually looked like in the middle of the 15th century, not the Europe of later legend, confident and ascendant, but the real thing, battered, fragmented, expensive, and running out of room to maneuver. The civilization that would remake the world was, at the moment it began that project, one of the weakest major political entities on Earth. Its kingdoms were small, its wars constant, its institutional knowledge of the wider world embarrassingly thin. It had no business attempting what it was about to attempt. That is, in the end, precisely why it did. Europe in 1450 was a patchwork of competing crowns, none of them dominant. England and France had spent most of the preceding century consuming each other in the 100 Years' War, a grinding, ruinously expensive series of campaigns that devastated the French countryside, hollowed out both treasuries, and ended with France's population roughly half what it had been a century before. The war finished in 1453, the same year Constantinople fell. England promptly collapsed into its own dynastic civil war, the Wars of the Roses, which would last for another 30 years. The Holy Roman Empire, which nominally governed a vast swath of Central Europe, was a loose coalition of hundreds of competing principalities that could barely agree on who their emperor was, let alone mount a coordinated foreign policy. Spain did not yet exist as a unified kingdom. The Black Death had visited Europe in 1347 and taken somewhere between a third and half of the population in the space of a few years. It returned repeatedly through the late 14th and early 15th centuries in smaller but devastating waves. By the mid-1400s, the population of Western Europe was still significantly below what it had been before the first outbreak, and some regions would not recover their pre-plague numbers for another century. The social disruption this produced was profound. The feudal structures that had organized European agriculture and political life had been badly damaged. The Church's authority had been shaken by its inability to explain or prevent the catastrophe, and the psychological atmosphere of the continent had been darkened by decades of mass death and theological uncertainty. This is the Europe that faced the Ottoman expansion. It had no unified response because it had no mechanism for unity. When Constantinople fell, the Pope called for a crusade and found no takers. The European kingdoms were too busy with their own wars, their own debts, and their own succession crises to mount anything coherent. The Venetians, who had the most to lose commercially, negotiated the best trade access terms they could with the new Ottoman administration and quietly resumed business. They were practical people. The rest of Europe simply absorbed the news and worried. And yet, and this is the crucial tension, Europe was not economically primitive. The Italian city-states, Venice and Genoa above all, had developed financial instruments and commercial institutions of extraordinary sophistication, letters of credit, double-entry bookkeeping, insurance contracts, banking networks that reached from London to Constantinople. The great merchant families of Florence had developed systems of long-distance commercial organization that predated anything in the Atlantic kingdoms by generations. Europe's problem was not that it lacked commercial sophistication. Its problem was that all that sophistication was locked into a system, the overland and Mediterranean spice trade, that was now structurally compromised by Ottoman expansion and controlled at every critical node by someone else. The tools of navigation that Europe possessed in 1450 were, by any reasonable comparison with China or the Islamic world, crude. European cartography was a mixture of classical misreadings and theological invention maps that placed Jerusalem at the center of the known world, filled the Southern Ocean with monsters, and had no reliable account of what lay beyond the African coast. The compass, adopted from China via the Islamic world, was in use but imprecisely understood. The astrolabe, a product of Islamic astronomical science, was beginning to circulate among educated navigators, but had not yet been systematically applied to oceanic sailing. European ships of the early 15th century were coastal vessels, built for the relatively enclosed waters of the Mediterranean and the North Sea, not for the open Atlantic. What changed this, slowly and unevenly through the first half of the 15th century, was the synthesis. Byzantine scholars, fleeing to Italy, brought Ptolemy's geographical framework, a coordinate system that understood the Earth as a sphere and could, in principle, calculate the size of the oceans. Islamic navigational instruments filtered through the Mediterranean trading networks and were adopted and refined by Iberian sailors. The latent sail, a triangular configuration that allowed a ship to tack against the wind rather than wait for it, had been developed by Arab mariners in the Indian Ocean and was now being incorporated into the hybrid vessel that the Portuguese were developing on the Atlantic coast, the caravel. The caravel was not a great ship by Chinese or Islamic standards. It was small, light, maneuverable, and capable of sailing into headwinds. It was exactly the right tool for feeling one's way down an unknown coastline. The kingdom that first put these pieces together was not one of the great powers of Europe. Portugal, in the mid-1400s, was a small Atlantic kingdom of perhaps 1 million people, pressed against the southwestern corner of the continent with the ocean directly at its back. It had finished its own version of the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Iberian territory from Muslim rule early, by 1249, giving it 2 centuries of political stability that most of its neighbors had not enjoyed. It had a coastline that pointed south toward Africa and west toward the open Atlantic. It had a commercial class desperate for access to goods that were being made ever more expensive by the Ottoman intermediary chain. And it had, in the early decades of the 15th century, a royal house with the specific combination of ambition and geography to do something about it. The men who actually sailed the early Portuguese expeditions were not, in most cases, visionaries or idealists. They were working sailors, many of them from the coastal towns of the Algarve and the Minho, men who had grown up fishing the Atlantic and knew its patterns and moods. When the Crown began financing expeditions down the African coast in the 1410s and 1420s, these sailors did not experience themselves as agents of historical transformation. They experienced themselves as men doing a dangerous job for pay, feeling their way around a coastline they had never seen, making notes of currents and landmarks, and returning if they could. The history books remember the admirals. The expeditions ran on the work of men whose names were never recorded. The commercial desperation that drove these expeditions was real and specific. The Portuguese crown wanted gold. West Africa had long been known, through the trans-Saharan trade, to be a source of enormous quantities of it. The 14th century Catalan atlas depicted a black ruler in the African interior, holding a gold nugget so large it glowed on the map. That gold reached North African and then European markets through Muslim intermediaries who controlled the Saharan caravan routes and who had no interest in cutting out their own margin. If a Portuguese ship could reach the West African coast directly, it could access gold, and eventually, it turned out, enslaved people without paying the Muslim markup. That was the calculation. It was not romantic. It was not about discovery. It was about cutting out the middleman. By the 1440s, the Portuguese had reached the West African coast and established the first tentative trading contacts. By the 1450s, they were pushing further south, past the point where any European sailor had ventured before, into waters that their charts showed as blank, and their theology had always populated with warnings. Each voyage extended the known coastline a little further. Each return brought information that the next voyage could build on. It was accumulation, not revelation, a slow, systematic reduction of the unknown, funded by a crown that understood, however dimly, that the route around Africa might eventually reach the source of the spices that were making Venice and the Ottomans rich. There is something almost paradoxical about what Europe's weakness produced. A stronger civilization, one that was commercially satisfied, geographically secure, and politically unified, would have had less reason to take the risk. China had been strong enough to choose retreat. The Islamic world was rich enough not to need a different route. Byzantium had been reduced to irrelevance before it could act on its knowledge. Only Europe, sitting at the wrong end of the trade routes, excluded from the profits of a system it depended on, and possessed of just enough navigational technology to make the attempt plausible, had the specific combination of need and capability that pointed toward the ocean. Its weakness was the engine of its eventual dominance. That is the central irony of the whole story. What was accumulating in the Atlantic kingdoms of Europe through the middle decades of the 15th century was not confidence. It was necessity. The distinction matters. Confidence produces strategy. Necessity produces improvisation, a series of desperate, incremental gambles made by people who did not fully understand what they were doing, but understood very well that they had to do something. The age of exploration, when it came, would wear the costume of ambition. Underneath, it was fear. By 1460, Portugal had mapped nearly 2,000 miles of African coastline it had never known existed. The route around Africa, the route to India, to spices, to the wealth that was currently flowing through Ottoman hands was beginning to look possible. Not certain, not safe, but possible. And in the calculus of a civilization with no other options, possible is enough. If you had to design a European kingdom most likely to break open the globe, you would not design Portugal. It was small, perhaps 1 million people in 1400, smaller than many individual Italian cities by wealth and influence. It had no great universities, no dominant merchant banking families, no long tradition of philosophical innovation. It sat at the far southwestern corner of the continent, away from the main arteries of European commerce, pressed between Castile to the east and the Atlantic to the west. What Portugal had, and what no other European kingdom had in the same combination, was finished. It had finished its wars, finished its internal consolidation, and finished its reconquista, the 7-century struggle to expel Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula by 1249. 2 full centuries before Spain achieved the same thing. That surplus of stability, in a continent convulsed by conflict, turned out to matter enormously. The House of Avis, which had ruled Portugal since 1385, was a dynasty with a clear-eyed understanding of its own limitations. Portugal could not compete with France or England or the Italian city-states on their own terms. It was too small, too poor, too peripheral. What it could do was orient itself differently. The Atlantic coastline was not an obstacle or a frontier to be feared. It was the one geographical asset Portugal possessed that its rivals did not. The fishing communities of the Algarve and the Minho had worked those waters for generations. The winds and currents of the eastern Atlantic were familiar to Portuguese sailors in a way they were not to Venetians or Genoese, whose experience was concentrated in the Mediterranean. The opening move came in 1415. King John I of Portugal assembled a fleet of 200 ships and roughly 40,000 men and crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to attack Ceuta, a heavily fortified Muslim port on the Moroccan coast that controlled one of the main outlets of the trans-Saharan gold trade. The attack was swift and successful. Ceuta fell in a single day. Among the Portuguese commanders who led the assault was the king's young son, Infante Dom Henrique, a prince who would come to be known to history as Henry the Navigator. Though he never navigated anything himself, and the formal school of navigation credited to him in later legend almost certainly never existed. What Henry did do was look at the warehouses of Ceuta, the gold, the ivory, the spices that had arrived there from across the Sahara, and understand with absolute clarity what was on the other side of the desert, and what it would be worth to reach it without a middleman. From his base at Sagres on the southern tip of Portugal, Henry spent the next 4 decades methodically financing, organizing, and directing the most sustained program of geographical reconnaissance the world had yet seen. He assembled cartographers, astronomers, instrument makers, and experienced pilots. He was not a romantic. He was a systematic investor in information. Each voyage went a little further down the African coast than the last. Each return brought charts, soundings, descriptions of currents, and intelligence about the peoples and resources of the coastline. The knowledge was cumulative. The voyages built on each other in a way that Chinese or Islamic exploration had never institutionalized, not because those civilizations lacked the capability, but because no one had decided to fund the accumulation itself as a long-term project. In 1434, a Portuguese captain named Gil Eanes sailed past Cape Bojador, a point on the Moroccan coast that had become a psychological barrier for European sailors who believed the waters beyond it were unnavigable, infested with sea monsters, and heated by the proximity of the sun to the point of boiling. Gil Eanes found none of these things. He found water, wind, and coastline extending further south. The barrier was not physical. It was imaginary. He sailed past it, turned around, and came home. It sounds like a modest achievement. It was, in fact, the first proof that the unknown could be entered systematically and survived, that the Atlantic south of the familiar world was not death, but simply ocean, unknown, because no one had looked. The expeditions accelerated. By the 1440s, the Portuguese had reached the West African coast in earnest, and the calculation that had driven the whole enterprise began to pay out. Gold was there, accessible by sea, bypassing the Saharan caravan routes that the Islamic world controlled. And something else was there too, something darker, people who could be captured and sold. In 1441, a Portuguese captain named Antão Gonçalves brought back the first Africans taken by force to Portugal. Henry the Navigator received a share of the profit. Within a few years, the Atlantic slave trade had begun, woven into the fabric of the exploration enterprise from its earliest stages. The wealth that flowed back to Portugal from West Africa, gold from the trading posts, people sold into slavery funded the next generation of voyages, which reached further, mapped more, and pushed the southern limit of the known world progressively downward. Henry died in 1460. By then, the Portuguese had mapped roughly 2,000 miles of African coastline that no European had known existed. He left behind something more valuable than any individual voyage, a self-sustaining institutional machine. The Order of Christ, which Henry had controlled and which had financed much of the exploration, continued its work. The knowledge accumulated at Sagres, the charts, the observations of currents and winds, the systematic records of each expedition passed to the next generation of pilots and navigators. Portugal had built something China had not, a knowledge system that survived the death of its patron. The reign of King John II, who came to power in 1481, pushed the program into its decisive phase. John was one of the most able rulers in Portuguese history, cold, methodical, and entirely clear about what he wanted. He wanted India. Not the West African coast, not trading posts in the Gulf of Guinea, but the source of the spices themselves, the Indian subcontinent and the islands beyond it. He organized simultaneous approaches. He sent spies overland. The explorer Pero da Covilhã traveled through the Middle East and reached India disguised as a Muslim merchant, gathering intelligence on ports, winds, and routes. And he sent ships south along the African coast, pushing further than anyone had gone before, looking for the point where Africa ended. In August 1487, a Portuguese navigator named Bartolomeu Dias left Lisbon with 2 caravels and a supply ship. He sailed down the African coast past every previous Portuguese marker, and then, in January 1488, fierce storms drove his fleet south and east, away from the coast and into open water. When the storms abated, Dias turned north and found coastline, but it was facing east. He had, without entirely intending to, rounded the southern tip of Africa. He named the headland he eventually sighted the Cape of Storms. He wanted to press on to India. His crew refused. They had been at sea for months. Their provisions were low, and the Indian Ocean lay ahead of them, unknown and enormous. They turned back. Dias reached Lisbon in December 1488. His reception was muted. What he had achieved. Proof that Africa ended. Proof that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. Proof that a sea route to India existed was the answer to a question Portugal had been asking for 70 years. And yet the court received him without ceremony. No proclamations. No immediate expedition to follow up. John II renamed the Cape of Good Hope, and then, with characteristic deliberateness, waited. There were diplomatic complications with Castile, agreements to be negotiated, intelligence to be digested. 9 years passed before the next expedition sailed. Those 9 years matter because of what was happening simultaneously to the west. Columbus had been rejected by John II. In 1484, the Portuguese king's advisors had correctly calculated that Columbus's estimate of the distance to Asia via the Atlantic was far too optimistic, and that the voyage as proposed was probably suicidal. Columbus went to Spain instead. The 2 projects, the Portuguese eastern route around Africa and the Spanish western gamble across the Atlantic, were running in parallel, both products of the same commercial desperation. Both pointed at the same destination. They would both arrive within 6 years of each other. The world that resulted would be shaped by both. The Portuguese program was not glamorous. It was not driven by curiosity or wonder, or a philosophical hunger to understand the shape of the earth, though individual navigators may have felt all of those things. It was driven by commercial logic and royal ambition in a kingdom that had run out of room to expand in any other direction. The genius of it was institutional. The methodical accumulation of geographical knowledge across multiple reigns, the reinvestment of each voyage's findings into the next, the deliberate construction of a knowledge system that outlasted any individual patron. Europe had produced nothing like it before. It would not have been possible without the specific combination of Atlantic geography, dynastic stability, commercial desperation, and institutional continuity that only Portugal, in only this moment, possessed. When Vasco da Gama finally left Lisbon on 8 July 1497 with 4 ships and a crew of 170 men, he carried with him the accumulated knowledge of 70 years of Portuguese exploration, the charts, the current data, the intelligence gathered by Covelin overland, the navigational understanding of the South Atlantic winds that Dias had proved could carry a ship around the Cape. He rounded Africa in good order, made contact with Arab pilots on the East African coast, and reached Calicut on the southwest coast of India in May 1498. The route was open. The Ottoman intermediary was bypassed. The world had changed, though almost no one in it yet understood quite how completely. Bartolomeu Dias did not live to see what his rounding of the Cape made possible. In May 1500, during a later expedition, his ship was caught in a storm off the Cape of Good Hope, the cape he had named the Cape of Storms, the cape that had since been renamed to celebrate the hope it represented and went down with all hands. He died at the place that made him. The ocean he had opened was already, by then, full of Portuguese ships. Nobody in the 15th century set out to explore the world because they thought exploration was good in itself. Every voyage that left a European harbor was funded by someone who expected a return, sanctioned by a church that expected souls, and crewed by men who expected to come home. The age of exploration was not driven by wonder. It was driven by a specific combination of commercial desperation, religious ideology, and dynastic ambition, three forces that happened to point in the same direction at the same moment, and that together produced a justificatory language so powerful it could sustain enterprises that would otherwise have seemed, by any rational calculation, suicidal. Understanding that language, what it said, what it concealed, and why it was necessary, is essential to understanding why the age of exploration happened when it did and in the form it took. Start with gold, because gold was always the honest answer. What the Portuguese crown wanted when it began financing voyages down the African coast was access to the West African gold trade, the same gold that had been flowing north across the Sahara in Muslim caravans for centuries, arriving in European markets only after paying tribute at every stage. A sea route to the West African coast would bypass every one of those intermediaries. The calculation was simple, and it was the calculation that drove the first generation of Portuguese exploration. When Henry the Navigator walked through the warehouses of Ceuta in 1415 and saw what was arriving from the interior of Africa, he understood what his kingdom was paying for and what it would be worth to cut out the people it was paying to. Spices came second, or rather, spices were always present alongside gold in the imaginations of the men who funded the voyages. The spice trade was the other great engine of commercial desire. Pepper from India, nutmeg from the Moluccas, cloves from the islands of the Indonesian archipelago. These were the commodities that had made Venice fabulously wealthy and the Ottoman Empire a structural power over European commerce. The Portuguese long-term goal was not West African gold alone, but the source of the spices themselves. A direct sea route to India that would allow the Portuguese crown to buy pepper in Calicut at source prices and sell it in Lisbon at something approaching what Europeans were currently paying Venice. The margin on that transaction was enormous. The route was the asset. But neither gold nor spices could be the public language of a 15th-century European enterprise. A king could not stand before his court and say, "We are sending men to their probable deaths because we want to undercut the Venetian pepper monopoly." Commerce, in the moral vocabulary of medieval Christendom, was a necessary evil, something the lower orders engaged in, not something that animated a crown. What animated a crown, in that vocabulary, was God. And so God entered the story, not as an afterthought, but as the primary grammar of justification, the language in which commercial ambition could be stated in terms that a medieval society could sanction, fund, and celebrate. The crusading framework was not invented for the age of exploration. It had been the dominant ideology of European expansion for 3 centuries, providing a moral and theological wrapper for military enterprises that were equally about land and wealth. What the 15th century did was redirect it. The Crusades to the Holy Land had failed and receded. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 had placed Christendom on the defensive. The energy that had once been pointed east toward Jerusalem was now available to be pointed elsewhere. The papal bulls that sanctioned Portuguese exploration, Dum Diversas in 1452, Romanus Pontifex in 1455, explicitly cast the enterprise as a continuation of the holy war against Islam, authorizing the Portuguese crown to reduce Muslims and pagans to perpetual servitude and seize their lands for the faith. The exploration of Africa was, in this framing, a crusade conducted at sea. The language worked because it was not entirely cynical. Columbus genuinely believed he was doing God's work. His journals record his conviction that the wealth he would bring back from Asia would fund the reconquest of Jerusalem, that the enterprise of the Indies was, at its spiritual core, a crusade by other means. He wrote to Ferdinand and Isabella that a ton of gold collected from the new lands would be enough, he estimated, to allow the sovereigns to fit out an expedition to reclaim the Holy Sepulchre. He was not performing piety for his patrons. He meant it. The religious motivation and the commercial motivation were not separate layers in the minds of the men who made the voyages. They were fused, as they had been fused in the Crusades before them, into a single compound of ambition and conviction that was more durable than either element alone. Glory was the third element, and it ran through both the religious and the commercial frameworks, without being reducible to either. A Portuguese navigator who rounded a cape that no European had rounded before was not just earning a wage or serving the faith, he was making a name. The culture of honor and nobility that structured European aristocratic life assigned enormous value to deeds, to things done that could not be undone, to achievements that attached permanently to a man's lineage. Exploration offered that, not just profit or piety, but permanence. A cape, an island, a coastline bore the name of the man who first charted it. The stone pillars that Portuguese navigators planted on African beaches were acts of territorial and personal inscription simultaneously. We were here. This is ours. Our names are attached to this place. Spain entered the story through this same compound of motivations, but with its own specific timing that turned out to matter enormously. Ferdinand and Isabella had spent the previous decade fighting the final campaign of the Reconquista, the 7th-century effort to expel Muslim rule from the Iberian Peninsula. On 2 January 1492, they received the keys of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. The Reconquista was over. The military machine that had sustained it, the crusading ideology that had powered it, and the political energy that had been entirely consumed by it were suddenly available for redirection. Within months, Columbus had his funding. The connection was not coincidental. Spain had just finished one holy war. It was immediately ready to begin another, in a different direction. The papal machinery moved quickly to sanction the new enterprise. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the bull Inter Caetera, effectively dividing the non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal along a north-south line in the Atlantic, granting each crown dominion over whatever lands their sailors found on their respective sides. The language was explicitly religious. The purpose of the grant was the propagation of the Christian faith among peoples living in barbarism. The effect was explicitly commercial and territorial. 2 European kingdoms had just been handed, by the Bishop of Rome, sovereign rights over half the planet, including all the people who happened to be living on it. The theological wrapper was paper-thin. The appetite inside was enormous. There is a structural point worth naming clearly, because it explains something important about why the justificatory language was necessary rather than merely convenient. The voyages were genuinely dangerous. A sailor boarding a caravel in Lisbon in 1480 for an expedition down the African coast understood that he might not return from storm, from scurvy, from unknown waters, from contact with peoples whose responses could not be predicted. The mortality rate on early oceanic voyages was appalling. Something beyond a wage was required to put men in those boats. Ideology, the compound of faith, glory, and commercial promise, supplied what money alone could not. A reason to risk one's life that was expressible in terms that made the risk feel meaningful rather than merely hazardous. The people on the other end of these voyages, the African communities that Portuguese sailors first encountered along the coast, the peoples of the Caribbean who watched Columbus arrive, the populations of Asia whose trading systems the Portuguese would eventually enter by force, had no part in constructing this justificatory language. They were its objects, not its authors. The papal bulls that authorized their subjugation were issued in cities they had never heard of, in a language none of them spoke, by a religious authority they had never been asked to recognize. The language of God, gold, and glory was the internal grammar of a European project. Its consequences were experienced everywhere. What the justificatory language did, above all, was sustain. Individual voyages could fail, ships could sink, expeditions could return empty-handed, sailors could die of disease before they reached their destination. What the compound of ideology provided was continuity across failure. Because the enterprise was framed as the will of God, as the duty of Christian kings, as the path to glory for the men who succeeded, individual disasters did not discredit it. They became occasions for renewed effort. The Portuguese program survived decades of incremental, unglamorous coastal exploration precisely because it was embedded in a framework of justification that could absorb failure and reframe it as the price of eventual triumph. That capacity to sustain effort across failure is what ultimately distinguished the European oceanic enterprise from anything that had come before it. In the summer of 1492, a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus stood on the dock at Palos in southern Spain and looked at three small ships. The largest, the Santa Maria, was perhaps 80 feet long. The other two, the Niña and the Pinta, were smaller still. His crew of around 90 men included experienced sailors and convicted criminals given the choice between prison and the voyage. They carried provisions for a year. They were sailing west into open ocean toward a destination whose distance Columbus had calculated to be roughly a quarter of what it actually was. Every serious geographer in Europe who had examined his proposal had told him his numbers were wrong. They were right. He sailed anyway. Columbus's theory was not entirely mad. He knew the Earth was spherical educated. Europeans had known this for centuries. The flat Earth myth, a much later invention. What he had miscalculated was the size of the sphere. He believed Asia lay roughly 5,000 miles to the west of the Canary Islands. It is actually 12,000. Had the American continents not existed, his entire crew would have died of thirst and starvation somewhere in the mid-Pacific, long before reaching anything. The Americas saved him. He did not know that. When he made landfall on a small island in the Bahamas on the morning of the 12th of October, 1492, he stepped ashore, believing he had reached the outlying islands of Asia. He called the people he found there Indians. He would die, 14 years later, still believing he had found a route to the East Indies. He had cracked the world open by accident. The island, the local Lucayan people called Guanahani, Columbus renamed San Salvador, Holy Savior. He planted a flag, said a prayer, and began immediately asking about gold. The people he met wore small ornaments of it in their ears and noses, which he noted with intense interest in his journal. He sailed on through the Caribbean, reaching Cuba, which he believed might be China, and then Hispaniola, where he found gold in slightly larger quantities and established a small settlement of 39 men before turning for home. He returned to Spain in March 1493 with a handful of Caribbean people he had taken captive, some parrots, a little gold, and news that changed the shape of the known world overnight. The news spread through Europe with a speed that print had recently made possible. Gutenberg's press had been operating since the 1450s, and Columbus's letter to the Spanish crown was reproduced and circulated across the continent within weeks. Courts that had barely noticed Portugal's incremental progress down the African coast suddenly understood that the game had changed entirely. Spain had reached what Columbus was calling the Indies by sailing west. The implications for the balance of commercial and political power in Europe were immediately apparent to anyone who thought about them. Portugal and Spain recognized the implications for each other in particular, and the Pope was called in to divide the world between them, which, in 1493, he did, drawing a line down the Atlantic and assigning everything west of it to Spain, everything east to Portugal. The two smallest major powers in Europe had just been handed sovereign rights over the entire non-Christian world. Columbus made 3 more voyages to the Caribbean. On the second, he brought 17 ships and 1,200 men, settlers, soldiers, priests. On the third, he touched the mainland of South America for the first time, reaching the coast of what is now Venezuela in 1498, and dimly beginning to understand that what he had found was not an island chain off Asia, but something much larger. He died in 1506 without having resolved the question to his own satisfaction, still insisting in his final years that he had reached the coast of Asia. It was left to others to grasp what had actually happened, and to a Florentine navigator named Amerigo Vespucci, who sailed the South American coast in 1501 and 1502, to first articulate clearly in print that this was an entirely new continent, a fourth part of the world that no European map had ever shown. The continents that bear his name were named for Vespucci, not Columbus, because Vespucci understood what Columbus never quite admitted. While Columbus was making his Caribbean voyages, Portugal was completing its own project. The route around Africa had been proved by Dias in 1488. The intelligence gathered overland by Kovalhun in India had confirmed what lay at the other end. On 8 July 1497, Vasco da Gama left Lisbon with 4 ships and 170 men. He rounded the Cape of Good Hope in November, sailed up the East African coast, picked up an Arab pilot at Malindi who knew the Indian Ocean routes, and on 20 May 1498, 6 years and 6 months after Columbus had stepped ashore in the Bahamas, dropped anchor off the Indian city of Calicut. He had sailed from Europe to the source of the spices. The Ottoman intermediary was, for the first time in history, bypassed. Da Gama's reception at Calicut was not triumphant. The Zamorin, the local ruler, received him politely, but without enthusiasm. The gifts da Gama presented cloth, honey, wash basins were items common in West African ports, and they were received as an insult by a court accustomed to gold and jewels. The Arab merchants who had worked the Calicut spice trade for generations understood immediately what a Portuguese sea route to India would mean for their position, and they worked to undermine the negotiations. Da Gama returned to Portugal in 1499 with a modest cargo of spices, but a cargo that had cost 60 times less to obtain than the same goods would have cost through the Venetian and Ottoman chain. The margin was the point. It was everything. The world that existed in 1498 was not the world that had existed in 1488. 2 voyages, one west, one east, had fundamentally redrawn the map of commercial possibility in ways that no one had fully anticipated and no one yet entirely understood. Columbus had found a continent. Da Gama had found a route. Together, they had done something that neither had set out to do. They had broken the structural basis of Ottoman commercial power over Europe and simultaneously created a new geography in which the Atlantic, not the Mediterranean, would be the center of the world's economy. It had taken less than a decade. It would take another century for the full implications to become clear. What da Gama brought back was a proof of concept. What followed was a campaign. The Portuguese crown understood immediately that access to India by sea was worthless without the ability to hold that access against the Arab merchants who had operated the Indian Ocean trade for centuries. The second Portuguese expedition to India, under Pedro Álvares Cabral in 1500, carried armed warships alongside trading vessels. Cabral also, en route, swung far to the west to avoid the African coast's headwinds and accidentally reached the coast of Brazil, claiming it for Portugal under the Treaty of Tordesillas line. The Portuguese were annexing the world not by plan, but by momentum. By the first decade of the 16th century, the Portuguese had established fortified trading posts on the East African coast, at Hormuz on the Persian Gulf, and at Goa on the Indian coast. They were not trading in the Indian Ocean. They were imposing a toll system demanding that all ships in certain lanes carry Portuguese passes and pay Portuguese duties. The violence was systematic. Da Gama's second voyage in 1502 included the burning of a ship carrying pilgrims from Mecca with over 400 people aboard, sealed inside to prevent escape. The strategy was medieval crusade logic applied to Indian Ocean commerce, domination by force, sanctioned by papal authority, driven by the commercial calculation that controlling the route was worth any cost of maintaining it. The Islamic merchants, who had operated those routes peacefully for centuries, had no framework for what was arriving. In Spain, the momentum from Columbus's voyages produced its own escalating logic. The Caribbean settlements were established by 1500. By 1519, Hernán Cortés was in Mexico. By 1532, Francisco Pizarro was in Peru. The 2 great American empires, the Aztec and the Inca, each fell within 2 years of serious European contact. Not primarily to military defeat, but to the invisible advance of European diseases, to which the populations of the Americas had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza swept through communities that had never encountered them. Population estimates for the Americas before contact vary widely, but the decline after it was catastrophic, somewhere between 50 and 90% of the pre-contact population dead within a century. Entire civilizations, their cities, their languages, their accumulated knowledge, were gone before the colonizers had finished counting what they were inheriting. The silver that followed the demographic collapse was what reshaped the global economy. The mines of Potosi, in present-day Bolivia, discovered in 1545, produced more silver in the following century than the entire world had previously seen. That silver flowed east through Spain and Portugal into Europe, then further east into Asia, where Chinese demand for silver to pay taxes was essentially limitless. The global economy of the 16th century ran, in large part, on American silver. It funded Spain's wars, destabilized European price systems through the inflation it caused, and eventually reached the Ming dynasty's tax collectors, where it helped sustain the very empire whose withdrawal from the seas had made European expansion possible in the first place. The world was already interconnected. The age of exploration made it legible. Venice felt the rupture within a generation. The pepper price in European markets dropped by more than half after 1500, as Portuguese ships began landing Indian spices at Lisbon at prices that undercut everything Venice could offer. The Venetians tried to compete, tried to maintain their arrangements with Egyptian and Ottoman intermediaries, tried to find a way to survive in a world that had suddenly reorganized around them. They could not. The center of European commercial gravity moved from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, from Venice and Genoa to Lisbon, and then, within another century, to Antwerp and Amsterdam and London. The cities that had been the world's great trading capitals in 1490 were provincial backwaters by 1600. The shift was absolute. Between 1492 and 1498, the world was permanently broken from its previous shape. Not improved, not transformed in any simple moral sense, but broken, its old structures of power and commerce dissolved, its geography rewritten, its population set in motion against each other in ways that would produce centuries of violence, extraction, and entanglement from which no part of the world emerged unchanged. What started as a Portuguese commercial strategy and a Genoese navigator's miscalculation about the size of the earth had produced something none of its architects had planned or could have predicted: the first truly global order, built on the ruins of everything that had come before it. The men who set this in motion wanted specific things. The Portuguese crown wanted gold and spice profits. Columbus wanted a title, a percentage, and a route to Asia. Ferdinand and Isabella wanted commercial advantage over Portugal and the prestige of a crusading Christian empire. What they got was something categorically different from any of it, a rupture so total that the world their grandchildren inherited bore almost no structural resemblance to the world they had been trying to improve their position within. This is worth sitting with. The age of exploration was not the execution of a vision. It was the accidental detonation of a set of pressures that had been building for half a century, and the world it produced was nobody's plan. The most immediate consequence was commercial, and it destroyed the very system it was meant to fix. Venice, which had organized European access to Eastern goods for 2 centuries and extracted its price at every stage, collapsed as a commercial power within a generation of da Gama's first voyage. The pepper price in Lisbon in 1505 was a fraction of what it had been in Venice in 1490. Merchants who had built fortunes on the Mediterranean spice trade found their entire business model obsolete. The Ottoman Empire, which had controlled the overland routes and collected its tolls with such structural confidence, found that the routes themselves had become secondary, that European ships had found a way to go around the system entirely. The thing Europe had been desperate to escape, it had escaped. The beneficiaries were not always those who had done the work. Portugal's profits from the Indian Ocean trade were real and substantial in the early decades of the 16th century. The Estado da India, the Portuguese commercial empire in Asia, extracted enormous wealth from the spice routes it controlled by force. But Portugal was a kingdom of 1 million people trying to administer trading posts and fortified positions from West Africa to Japan, stretched across 60,000 miles of ocean with a population that could barely staff the ships, let alone hold the territories. By the mid-16th century, the strain was visible. The Portuguese crown was borrowing heavily against future spice revenues to fund the present. By the end of the century, the Dutch and English latecomers to the oceanic enterprise, but better capitalized and more efficiently organized, had broken Portugal's grip on the eastern routes and begun building the commercial empires that would define the next 3 centuries of global history. Spain's trajectory was different, and in some ways, more instructive. The silver of the Americas above all, the mountain of it that poured from the mines of Potosi in Bolivia after 1545, made Spain the richest kingdom in Europe for most of the 16th century. It also, over time, destroyed the Spanish economy. When silver floods a monetary system, prices rise. When prices rise faster than production, domestic industry becomes uncompetitive. Spain imported what it could have made, spent what it could have invested, and fought wars that the silver encouraged it to believe it could afford. By 1600, Spain was technically the wealthiest major power in Europe, and structurally one of the weakest. The silver passed through Spain on its way to paying Spanish debts to German and Flemish bankers, who used it to fund the industries and trade networks of Northern Europe. The mine had enriched everyone except the miners. The demographic consequences of what the exploration produced were the largest in human history up to that point, and they fell almost entirely on people who had played no part in causing them. The peoples of the Americas in 1491 numbered somewhere between 50 and 100 million, a range that reflects genuine uncertainty, but in any case, represents an enormous share of humanity. Within a century of contact, between 80 and 90% of that population was gone. The mechanism was disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus pathogens that had circulated in Eurasian populations for millennia, generating partial immunity over generations, arrived in the Americas as absolute novelties. Immune systems that had never encountered them had no response. The dying began before European colonists arrived in most regions, carried inland by trade networks faster than any ship could sail. Communities collapsed before anyone from the outside world appeared to explain what was happening. The scale of this depopulation shaped everything that followed. It was the emptying of the Americas that made European colonization as rapid and total as it was. Cortés did not conquer the Aztec Empire with 600 men. He arrived in a world already being destabilized by disease, found allies among peoples who had their own reasons to resist Aztec dominance, and then benefited from the catastrophic smallpox epidemic that swept Tenochtitlan in 1520, killing its emperor and decimating its defenders. The military conquest was real, but it was the biological catastrophe that made it decisive. The same pattern repeated across the hemisphere in Mexico, in Peru, in the Caribbean, in North America. Everywhere the pattern was the same. Disease first, collapse of social structure second, European occupation of the ruins third. The labor shortage that followed depopulation produced the Atlantic slave trade, the third of the great consequences that nobody had planned. Sugar cultivation, which required enormous quantities of intensive hand labor, had been introduced to the Caribbean islands almost immediately after Spanish settlement. Indigenous labor, already decimated by disease, was exhausted within a generation by the combination of epidemic and forced work. The solution the colonists reached for was enslaved African labor. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships were already transporting Africans to Atlantic island sugar plantations. After 1500, the trade expanded with the Americas as its destination, and it never stopped. Over the following 3.5 centuries, approximately 12.5 million Africans were loaded onto ships and transported across the Atlantic. Perhaps 2 million died at sea. The remainder were put to work in conditions that consumed lives so rapidly that the trade had to continue simply to maintain the labor supply. The African societies from which the enslaved came paid consequences that did not end with the immediate loss of their people. The Atlantic slave trade ran partly on the cooperation of African rulers and merchants who sold captives taken in warfare or raiding. But the scale and duration of the trade intensified the warfare that produced those captives, destabilizing West and Central African political structures across a span of 4 centuries. Kingdoms that might have developed along their own internal logic were instead reorganized around the production of human beings for export. The disruption was not uniform. Some states grew powerful as intermediaries, but across the region, the long-term effect was demographic drain, political instability, and a continent systematically weakened at exactly the moment when European power was growing strong enough to colonize it directly. The slave trade preceded and enabled the colonial era. They were the same project in two phases. The ecological consequences were as sweeping as the human ones, though they unfolded over a longer timescale. European animals arrived in the Americas alongside European people: horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, rats. They encountered ecosystems that had evolved without them over tens of thousands of years and had no adaptive response. Horses spread across the North American plains, transforming the hunting cultures of peoples who had never seen them into equestrian societies within 2 generations. Cattle and pigs consumed and trampled ecosystems that had been stable for millennia. Rats came ashore at every port and worked their way inland. The American landscape of 1600 was already substantially different from the landscape of 1491, and the transformation was accelerating. Meanwhile, American crops moved in the other direction. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, cacao entered Eurasian agriculture and changed diets, extended growing seasons, increased caloric yields, and contributed to the European population explosion of the 17th and 18th centuries. The potato alone probably fed more Europeans than any other single crop in the 2 centuries after its introduction. The political consequences reorganized Europe itself. The enormous wealth flowing from the Atlantic and Indian Ocean trades shifted power decisively away from the Mediterranean city-states, Venice, Genoa, Florence, toward the Atlantic nation-states. Portugal and Spain dominated the 1st century. The Netherlands dominated the 17th century. England emerged as the dominant Atlantic power in the 18th, and the global commercial and military infrastructure it built on the back of the Atlantic trade, the Royal Navy, the East India Company. The financial systems of the City of London became the platform for the Industrial Revolution that would, in turn, produce the world of the 19th and 20th centuries. The chain of causation runs directly from the Ottoman closure of the overland routes in the mid-15th century to the world that exists today. Every link in it was contingent. None of it was inevitable. The Team PA. The intellectual consequences were, in their own way, as profound as the material ones. Europe in 1490 understood the world through a framework that was classical in its geography, theological in its cosmology, and profoundly parochial in its assumptions about what humanity looked like. The Americas shattered all of it. Here were tens of millions of people, civilizations with cities, agriculture, astronomy, art, complex political organization, who had existed in complete isolation from the Eurasian world for 15,000 years. Their existence was not reconcilable with the biblical account of human origins, or with Ptolemy's geography, or with the Aristotelian natural philosophy that had organized European thought for 3 centuries. The encounter with the Americas produced, over the following 2 centuries, a slow, painful, and profoundly destabilizing intellectual revolution, the collapse of the medieval worldview, and the emergence of something new that would eventually be called the scientific method. The people who built the New World, the sailors who died of scurvy on da Gama's return voyage, the enslaved Africans who cut sugar on Hispaniola, the Aztec farmers who watched their city burn, the Portuguese factors who kept accounts in Goa and Malacca did not experience themselves as participants in a world historical event. They experienced hunger, fear, grief, profit, violence, and survival. History is made from the inside like that, without perspective, without the view from above that makes the pattern visible. The pattern only becomes legible from far enough away. And from far enough away, what the age of exploration produced looks like this: a civilization backed against the Atlantic, by forces it didn't fully understand, improvising its way through desperation toward solutions it couldn't entirely foresee, and in so doing, connecting the world in ways that remade every part of it, including the civilization that started the process, which was changed most of all. The Ottoman Empire, whose consolidation had set all of this in motion, survived for another 4 centuries after 1453. It remained a great power into the 19th century. But the commercial logic that had made it a structural constraint on European ambition slowly ceased to matter as the Atlantic routes superseded the overland ones. The toll booth still stood. The traffic simply stopped using the road. The empire that had been the instrument of European desperation outlasted the desperation itself, presiding over routes that the world had moved on from, collecting duties that nobody paying them regarded as existential anymore. Empires decline slowly, usually, and the Ottoman decline was slower than most. But the mechanism of it began in the moment Portuguese ships found a way around the system the Ottomans had believed they controlled. The question this story began with why Europe, why the 1400s, why it all has an answer now. Not a simple one, because the real answers never are. Europe went to sea because it was cut off. It succeeded because it was desperate enough to attempt what wealthier, more comfortable civilizations had no reason to risk. The civilization least obviously positioned to crack open the globe was the one that did it because it was the only one that had no choice. And the world that resulted globally connected, hierarchically brutal, ecologically transformed, institutionally shaped by the specific pressures and pathologies of 15th century European commercial desperation is still, in its deepest structures, the world we live in, not the world anyone planned. The world accident made.